So for me, I discovered black metal when I was still at school, and actually I'd stopped going to school when I was about 14, I guess. And because of that, I used to spend quite a lot of time in town at record stores, and I was already interested in metal. So what would happen is that the college kids who were into metal would see this kid with, a Paradise Lost t-shirt or whatever, and say, have you heard about, you seem to be into metal, have you heard about these bands? And so via sort of two or three people I met that way, they got me into black metal. So I was already interested in extreme metal, and I'd got into metal via the usual bands of the time, which was sort of Megadeth, Metallica, Sepultura, and from that I went into heavier music such as Carcass and Bolt Thrower and other death metal bands, because death metal had a presence and was quite, I wouldn't say mainstream, especially in the UK at that time, but it was accessible. But these older friends of mine, they introduced me to black metal via copied cassettes, and actually I didn't have any idea really about the history behind it or any of the controversy or even really the aesthetics of it, because I was being given dubbed cassettes that featured bands like Cradle of Filth, Hecate Enthroned, Gorgoroth, Emperor, all the bit, the sort of the key names back in the early to mid 90s, and I had no idea what they looked like because you couldn't really find black metal in England in record stores, even Cradle of Filth back then. So it was quite a shock when I, having got really interested in these cassettes, started hanging out with these older guys who were into black metal and saw pictures of the bands with corpse paint, for example. That was a surprise because when I got into the genre musically, I had no idea about that. So that's something that I suppose is really of its time, because now if you were to get into black metal, there's no way you'd not know about the aesthetics, and with the internet you'd see probably pictures even before you heard the music. But what attracted me to black metal, and probably the reason why I got so into that more than death metal, although I still love death metal, but death metal had the extremity and the brutality, and I really enjoyed that. But what fascinated me with black metal, and I guess what still fascinates me, is that it had more depth to it, and more kind of stylistic variety and emotional variety. So, when I heard something like Cradle of Filth or Emperor, I was really impressed by how extreme it was. But to be honest, what also made a huge impact was the quiet part, not the quiet parts, but the more tranquil, beautiful parts. The fact that you could have this extremely dark, evil music, and then you would have, a piano piece, or even in Gorgoroth, there would be moments which would be more about atmosphere than just straight ahead brutality, and that seemed to me really interesting. I think that's still why black metal is so powerful, because it has this depth to it. And atmosphere was really, I think atmosphere is kind of a defining factor of black metal, and that was something that really impressed me. I mean, Gehenna was another one. If you think about Gehenna's first 3 albums, if you hear that as a kid and you only previously listened to stuff like Bolt Thrower, Sepultura, Carcass, it kind of throws you to hear these kind of peaceful, tranquil, emotional passages juxtaposed with this extreme aggression. Hecate Enthroned, Cradle of Filth, and other good examples of that. And even Emperor, when you hear those, like Nightside Eclipse, and you hear the keyboard sort of landscapes, that was something much more serious and much kind of deeper, and yeah, broader, actually, sort of musically broader than death metal. So at that point, I then looked into it more, and of course then I started reading interviews in fanzines and magazines like Terrorizer, and that was sort of, then I started to know more about the history of it. So it was about kind of seeking out more extreme and more types of metal, because at that time I was, exploring doom metal as well and other types of death metal, and that was also important. But black metal was obviously something kind of totally different from all that had come before. So that had a profound effect on me. I would say a bit of a mix of both. It wasn't really something I aimed for. At the time, I was a photographer. I was studying photography at university and photographing bands. That was one of the first things I started taking pictures of. And I was actually taking photos of bands for Century Media when I was quite young, and just for their website, and they wouldn't pay me, but they would, I can't remember if they paid for the film, because I was shooting film back then, obviously, but they did give me merchandise in trade, so it was kind of a good deal for both of us, because I got a few CDs or shirts or whatever that I wanted. I also got to see my pictures online, which, pre-social media was quite a exciting thing and a bit more difficult, much more difficult than it is now, actually. Now anyone can put their photos online, but in the early 2000s to have it on a sort of proper website was a bit more of an achievement, maybe. But anyway, so I was already a photographer, and I had a photograph. The first photograph I had published in Terrorizer was when I was still, I think, in the first year of university. And I became a photographer for them before I became a writer. So that was towards the end of my university course. I was photographing for them quite regularly, both live photos and also portraits, which was, kind of a more interesting thing, I guess. And I think Christian was the first. I did a portrait session with them on the roof of the Underworld, World's End in London. I think that was the first thing I photographed for them that wasn't a live photo. And at the same time, at the end of in the last year of my university course, I decided to do a fanzine, because it was 2003 and paper fanzines had been a really big thing. All around the world, but especially in UK. When I was a kid going to my first black metal shows, there would always be like 2 or 3 guys selling their fanzine outside, and I would always, whenever I could, I would buy fanzines, and was quite a big reader of that. And there was also Terrorizer magazine, which I think is still the most important magazine, high street metal magazine of the 90s. And that was British as well, so it was quite accessible, and the people were quite accessible, because the gigs they reviewed were in London, or at least in UK, so that made it a bit easier for me, because I was studying in London. So I did this fanzine as a sort of nostalgic thing, almost, because paper fanzines had been replaced by webzines. I kind of wanted to, I think at that time there were no fanzines, or maybe 1 or 2 that had come out over those early 2000s, but there really wasn't much. So I created this fanzine called Crypt, and Crypt was supposed to be, it was a fanzine, it was kind of supposed to be a cross between a fanzine like Slayer or The Dead Sea, which was a British fanzine that we've actually published in via Cult Never Dies. We reprinted that a couple of years ago, but it was kind of that sort of underground fanzine, but it was also mixed with my idea of what a high street magazine could be, or a sort of, a Terrorizer style magazine, because at that time I think I was looking at Terrorizer. I wasn't a part of it except for taking photos, and I just thought I'd like to try and mix those two things, just as a project for myself, really. And yeah, in a way, it's funny because my fanzine back in 2004, 2005, in a way, is less underground than the stuff that Cult Never Dies deals with mainly. But it kind of wasn't supposed to be a totally it wasn't supposed to be a totally underground fanzine. It was supposed to show how somebody could self-publish and create on their own something which would be as good quality in writing, at least, as something like Terrorizer or Metal Hammer or something like that. So it's a sort of challenge to myself. And so we would have bands like we would have really underground death metal bands that from the UK, which people probably wouldn't have heard of. But then we'd also have bands like Napalm Death, Mayhem, Bolt Thrower, Arcturus, Archgoat. Who else did we have? Earth, one of the first interviews with Earth, kind of after they reformed. And also visual artists like Joe Patagno and Christoph Speidel. So it was quite a mix of things. And to cut a long story short, I did this fanzine. It was quite successful. I did 2 issues of it. And the first issue I sent to Terrorizer, and I started writing for them soon after. And the second issue I sent to Metal Hammer, and I had no ambitions to be a writer. My ambition was purely the writing of that fanzine was just a creative project, and also kind of my tribute in a way, or my contributing something to the scene. That would have been how I saw it then, and kind of how I see it now, I suppose. And I had no intentions to be a writer. The thing with Terrorizer is you didn't really get paid anything for writing for them, so you just did it for the pleasure. You got a little bit of money for photography, not much, but I was a student, so anything was better, than nothing. And so my ambitions at that time and intentions was to make a living from photography and design. And I sent an issue to Metal Hammer purely because I hoped that they would print a small review, and then I could sell some more copies, because I'd essentially spent all the money I had and gone into debt to produce this fanzine. And I think I printed 500 issues of the first one, and I sold most of them. And then I think the next issue I printed 700 or 800. And yeah, it was quite expensive, and I had no money. So I needed, I was trying to make some money back, and so I sent it to them, and they never did review it. But 2 days later, they wrote back to me and asked if I'd like to write for them in the extreme metal part of the magazine. So that was a huge moment, really, for me. And they did pay. So I started doing more writing for them, and I wrote for them quite a lot, really, over the years. I guess mostly between 2006 and 2000. I still write for them occasionally, but it was mainly between 2006 and 2013. And eventually, quite quickly, I got moved into the main magazine. So I wasn't just writing about extreme metal; I was writing about everything. So bands. Anyone you can imagine, like bands like Airborne and Buck Cherry, right through to bands like Watain and Marduk. It was, and it was a really good experience because, interviewing bands that I might not normally have listened to or been that interested in definitely improved my kind of skills as a writer and an interviewer. So it became kind of a part-time job. I think I was doing kind of, I was doing some cover stories, and I could make enough money to sort of as a part-time living alongside another job. Actually, I always had a full-time job doing design, so I tend to write this stuff kind of in the evenings and things. But later on, when I started my first book, I was working part-time for Metal Hammer, doing as a freelancer. And I always wanted to stay. I got offered to go into the office a couple of times and be like a full-time staff member twice. I was offered that, and I was tempted, but I kind of felt if I did that, I wouldn't be able to pursue my own thing, which was sort of, I knew in the back of my mind that I wanted to kind of create my own thing in some way, but I wasn't sure what that vehicle would be, whether it would be as a photographer or as a writer. I was still doing photography for magazines like Terrorizer and Record Collector, and then I was writing for Metal Hammer, so I was kind of, I was quite happy with that mix. And then I was doing my design and retouching jobs as well. So yeah, to answer the question, sorry, that's a bit of a long answer, but it wasn't a career path that I intended to follow, and it wasn't a long burning ambition. It was simply that I discovered that I could actually make a living doing something that I enjoyed and contributing to the scene. And once I realised that, I took writing more seriously, and I discovered really that I preferred writing to photography, even though I'd studied photography and had a degree in it. The writing came much more naturally and allowed me a little bit more freedom and a little bit more agency, I would say. It allowed me to have a bit more control. I think photography is sort of a fantastic art form, but in a working sense, you tend to have less control over your life and career than you do with writing. I think writing is a little bit more, it gives, you're not necessarily having to always work for somebody in the same way and sort of do what somebody, you have a bit more control over your expression, let's say. So yeah, that was why I focused on that. I guess I've kind of answered that in the previous answer. I only have good feelings, really, when I look back at being a writer for those magazines. And, there's no doubt that the experience is what built the foundations for what I do now. At the same time, I always had perhaps a slightly different outlook to those magazines and the writers for those magazines, because I wasn't really, most of the people that work for metal magazines have some sort of, or at least in England, have some sort of media ambition or media background. They've often studied journalism, and they're a little bit more ambitious or, geared up for that sort of world. And so it was really, doing some of the stuff I did for Metal Hammer was super fascinating, really, because, I was dealing with big bands that I wouldn't normally have had access to via, my fanzine and things. Megadeth, talking on the phone to Alice Cooper, or, I think I interviewed Alice Cooper 3 times, both in person and on the phone. Megadeth, members of Guns N' Roses, big bands, really, that I wouldn't normally have had access to, and that was a fantastic experience. And as I say, it definitely did strengthen me as a writer, and the whole kind of discipline of working to deadline and being able to talk to people comfortably, musicians, and to be honest, all that came much more naturally than photography in a way. Like, even though I'd studied that, I think I'm more naturally a good writer than a good photographer, let's say. I think, I had a good eye for photography, but I'm not. It's not something I could kind of ever feel like I wanted to do as a full-time living. And writing was much more comfortable. And it was they were good magazines to work for. It was good to see stuff in print. That was really rewarding. And they had very good writers, both of those magazines, and Record Collector also. So that was quite inspiring to be writing with other good writers, to have good editors, and they both had mostly good editors. Metal Hammer always had good editors. Terrorizer kind of jumped around a bit, but it was. I look back at it as a really important kind of part of my life, and most of the experiences were excellent, so I really can't complain. That's an interesting question. The answer would be, actually it was the opposite. Although you might expect underground bands to want to avoid or to have a prejudice against bigger media outlets such as Metal Hammer and Terrorizer, especially Metal Hammer, the answer is always the exact opposite, because 99.9% of underground metal bands, however much they identify themselves with the underground and dislike or set themselves in opposition against the mainstream of the rock and metal scene, without exception, I think, in my experience, they will always want to have that exposure, because it allows them to reach people and bring people into their world. And it's I think that's perfectly normal and justifiable, really, because very few people get into underground music without some exposure to more mainstream versions of that music. If you get into black metal, it's unlikely that you start off with the most underground band. You probably get into it via Watain or Cradle of Filth, or depending on what era you get into it. So that was never an issue. And I have to say, probably writing for Terrorizer and Metal Hammer helped a lot, because for two reasons. Firstly, when I approached people to do the books, they knew that I had the experience with those magazines, which is kind of a sign that that you are a proper writer, quote unquote, and that you have some sort of presence within that world. But the other thing was that I met a lot of those bands through those magazines. For example, I'd interviewed Watain for Metal Hammer. I'd interviewed Marduk for Metal Hammer. All sorts of bands I interviewed, actually, for fairly big magazines. As I say, Skyforger was another one. Dark Throne, you name it, really. So actually, there was never that conflict that you might expect between working for a mainstream magazine, or more mainstream magazine, and writing about underground metal. You might have expected there to be, and I think part of the reason was also that I was doing all this during the 2000s, and although Metal Hammer had been quite a main, had covered quite non-underground friendly stuff during the 90s, in the 2000s, especially the mid-2000s onward, they were covering quite a lot of black metal and death metal, and I think so their reputation had changed quite a lot. And as far as Terrorizer goes, I think most underground, even the most underground metal bands, were respectful of Terrorizer through the 2000s, at least up until maybe the mid-2000s. So, that again was a sort of that was helpful, really. So, in terms of my point of view on it, I obviously sort of consider myself to be working within the underground, and the concept of the underground is really important. not just within black metal or extreme metal, but in all sort of subcultures and subgenres. But as I say, there's always a trickle-down effect, and there's always a crossover with the more mainstream aspect. So I think it's important to have black metal in magazines that are on the high street, like Metal Hammer, for example, because that brings people in and informs people about it in a way that wasn't really possible before. When I got into black metal, it was because a few people had kind of told me about it, and if I hadn't met those people, it might have been longer before I'd discovered black metal. Now it's a bit different because you have the internet, but again, it's kind of the same argument. YouTube is probably the most mainstream media channel in the world. Everyone watches YouTube, and you could argue, like, should black metal be on YouTube? If you were really, if you were really wanting to sort of be totally underground, you wouldn't put your music on YouTube. But we all sort of understand that that's a way to reach people. So I think you have to use all the channels available, really, to reach people, but not compromise what you're doing. To me, that's sort of the key point when it comes to underground music and culture, is you don't compromise what you're doing in order to get more success. But if you can reach people and they like what you're doing, then that's, perfectly okay. So yeah, that would be my take on it.